with Stan. Stan, you're on the air. What can we do for you tonight?
Hello, hi. Hello, Christy and Dr. Ray. Nice to meet you both. And Matt, I was previously able to talk to you on another show.
Oh,
and
great.
I'm glad to be able to talk to you again.
Well, welcome back.
Hi. So what I wanted to talk about, I read this article recently, I guess it was last. New York just recently passed a law banning the legal defense of gay panic and trans panic.
Mm-hmm.
And so for your viewers who may not know what that is, gay panic is when, a person, assaults or even kills, like, for instance, a gay man, because they think, well, that guy was coming on to me, so I had no choice. I didn't realize I had no choice but to hurt him, and trans panic may be when, a man sees an attractive woman, goes up to her, realizes that she's trans, and then, of course, his sexuality is threatened, so he just has to murder her.
This idea that people could be so upset as to be legally insane, as to be irresponsible for their actions because they're so overwhelmed by somebody else's gender or sexuality, that they could commit murder and it wouldn't be their fault, because how could we possibly expect them to control themselves in that crazy idea? So New York State has said that this is not acceptable defense, that you can't murder somebody because you were so freaked out by their sexuality.
Yeah, it's one thing, when I heard this changed, I was happy. There's a Supreme Court ruling that actually kind of supports this, and that is the notion of fighting words, that there are words that you can say to someone that are just so offensive that no reasonable person could maintain control of their faculties, and so when they assault you or whatever else, they have a defense. And I have consistently maintained that is absolute bullshit. That what we're really doing is saying, this person's just so weak in character that uttering a phrase at them like "your mother's a whore" is enough for them to attack you.
Couldn't possibly be expected to maintain their composure in such a situation.
But a good chunk of people think this is a real thing, and it's a good thing, and it's still, Supreme Court precedent. I remember the debate that I did with Cy, where he was like, "Well, what if I said your wife was a whore? You'd want to punch me." And I was like, you just showed that you don't know me, because first of all, I wouldn't want to punch you. If my wife was a whore, then you're correct, and I wouldn't have any justification for being upset. And if she's not, then you're an idiot who clearly demonstrated he doesn't know my wife. So why would I punch you for that? I'll just let you sit here and keep making a fool of yourself.
Yeah, makes total sense.
If you think about this is actually, again, kind of moving with what we did earlier, an extension of another concept. From the 1780s, Blackstone, the legal book written by Blackstone on English common law, forgave men if they murdered their wife for adultery. And throughout the 1800s, it was acceptable. It was an accepted legal standard in almost every state in the United States.
Because it's so upsetting. How could you possibly be expected?
Well, even if your wife didn't commit adultery, if you suspected she committed adultery and you murdered her, you were still let off the hook with something far less, or maybe not at all. As recently as the 1970s, it was still being used as a legal defense. This is not unlike what we're seeing with what New York just did. States systematically went through and said, no longer are we going to allow the perception of your wife committing adultery give you permission to murder her. We're not going to let that happen anymore. But that took 2 centuries to overcome that. And I hope we get this done a lot faster, but there's absolutely no excuse for one person's behavior to cause another person to murder him. I mean, short of self-defense, which by definition is not murder, of course, but this isn't self-defense.
Yeah, no, this is some lizard brain bullshit where people are essentially saying, I was just so mad it's justified.
Yeah.
Okay. That's not going to fly here.
Yeah, justifiable homicide. Not with those things.
So Stan, that's the kind of the context. Did you have a particular question in all of that?
Oh yeah. So it got me thinking, and especially it being Pride Month, I like these laws. So I believe the article said New York would be the sixth state to pass a similar law, and they listed out the states, like including California and a few other states, and they were blue states, and it got me thinking. How many times have we given people the advice, and I'm sure maybe one of you has said it as well, right? When you tell like young gay kids, if you're in a small town, and you're facing persecution, maybe you just have to get up and move to like a big city, right? Like your closest big city, and you'll find a community there that can accept you, right? But looking at just the way this country is going and the extreme cultural split between red states and blue states, right? States run by conservatives, states run by liberals. It seems like what is our next step to tell people that you have to move from one state to another? Because it's a fact at this point that simply put in blue states, you have more rights than you do in red states. Like we can look at the abortion laws that have been passed recently across the red states. There's such a big difference between these two areas. It's like, what hope can we offer people who are in these states and have no hope of moving? And I think it's honestly an unreasonable thing to be asking them to do so. Like, what should we be telling them?
Yeah, I hear that. And the reality is, no matter how regressive the laws in Alabama, for instance, happen to be, there's still going to be queer people born there, no matter what they do to drive them out or to force them not to be there. There's still going to be women born there. Naturally, there's still going to be folks that are needing these types of protections. And I definitely hear what you're saying. I don't know that it's increasing. I'd love to hear y'all kind of weigh in on that. I mean, I know that certainly, there was a lot of folks who had to move north to get away from the slave-owning mindset of the South that, still hasn't entirely gone away, if we're being frank. But it's not the first time that folks have had to migrate in order to avoid persecution. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse?
I haven't seen statistics on that. I have friends leaving the United States.
Sure.
For those reasons.
Every time I'm asked whether X is getting better or worse, I have a hard time coming up with an answer unless I've seen like real data, because what we know is a lot of people have this perception that the world in general is getting worse, but the data show otherwise.
Right, and that's very much my take on these things in general. When we zoom out far enough, when we look at, infant mortality or literacy or, any of these measures of, I guess, progress with a big P. But yeah, when we zoom in, it does get really dicey to try and understand or interpret the data.
Yeah. And the internet has kind of amplified things in the same way that the network news, well, if it bleeds, it leads, and so you think the world's worse. The other thing is that the internet makes it appear that somebody like, it serves as an equal footing for people. So when you see someone like Steven Anderson or one of the McMurtry, the possibly pumpkin loving, jackass calling for the death of the LGBTQ community, it's easy, especially if you are a member of that community, to think, oh my God, the world's going to hell. And then you realize these are tiny little churches that nobody would know about and nobody would pay any attention to if it weren't for the fact that they can put up just an average YouTube video. It didn't even have to be slick. That could potentially be seen by everybody. And that what's often happening is, like, you might look at some terrible or person that you view with terrible ideas and say, holy crap, this person's got 500,000 followers. Well, how many of those followers are you presuming are in agreement with them? Because quite often people will be followed and monitored. What if we found out that one of these hate groups that have, let's say, 100,000 followers actually only have 5,000 people who agree with him. And the other 95,000 people paying attention to this are ones that are like, oh, we're going to make sure that every time you say something, we're going to expose it and everything else.
And or bots.
Yeah.
Like Russian,
Russian
decisive.
It gives an impression that may not map to reality.
Right. So I am 45 miles from Westboro Baptist Church, and they are like the
irrelevant.
They're becoming irrelevant. That's for sure. But even in Kansas, after 50 years of watching them, I think they've lost influence. You just don't hear about them as much, of course, since Fred died. But they're still alive and well, and they're still picketing, but they just aren't getting the hits anymore, so to speak. Other people are kind of taking their place, unfortunately, I think. Sure. But I think you're right. The magnification, the amplification is the internet's what pushes a lot of this stuff.
Well, and there is a certain level of habituation, because when we look at TV even 10 years ago, I mean, this year, Seinfeld, for instance, is celebrating its 30th anniversary, and I grew up loving that show, and I still think it's hilarious, but man, has it not aged well. Yeah. There are so many moments that I watch now that are just so cringy in terms of the way they talk about gay folks, the way they talk about women in general. And we are just now used to the idea that you can have gay characters, fully well-developed gay characters on TV, that you can have women with agency. It doesn't have to be like Grace Under Fire, like the entire show is about how she's a single mom. She can just be a single mom and also have a show. So we get used to that, and we forget that that's actually progress. So I do tend to believe that when you zoom out far enough, things are tracking in the right direction in almost every way, in terms of representation.
Except for climate change and immigration and,
Yeah, in terms of equality in those senses. But there are certainly blips. There are definitely problems.
I kind of disagree with maybe what you guys are saying, or maybe we're actually talking about two different things. I mean, I think that you guys are just giving are looking at this as in a general sense of like whether things are getting better or not, right? And what I feel I'm talking about are concrete steps to make people's lives more miserable, right? So like we can say that the long arm, like the long arc of history, bends towards justice, right? That things are generally getting better. But we can actually point to right now actual laws that are being passed that are actually hurting people, right? Yep. And I'm saying that like in certain areas of this country, like people simply have like more protections. You can just look at the books, you can compare like what's on the books between these two areas, and you can see that there's a stark difference, right? And I feel that difference is deepening, right? Like this isn't like a general sense like something that can be amplified by social media. Like these are real things.
Yeah, we're not saying everything's rosy, because when it comes to trans women in general, we started giving them equal rights, and then we start taking it away. And when there's laws, the inability or ineligibility to serve in the military again, there are real issues that need to be addressed, and if I don't have data, I don't want to like succumb to the panic, because it's like, I don't know how many people are watching right now, but I guarantee you that if one of us started screaming and said something outrageous, you could get that video clip to blow up on the internet. And people's perception might be that, well, this is what the show's about, or that we have a bigger audience than we do, or that we represent more people than we do, only because that blow up got attention. When you get away from the social media and just the conversations about it, and you talk about, as you are, what laws are actually being passed and what's being done to help people versus what's being done to hurt people, we are fucking up left and right and have a lot of stuff that needs to be fixed.
There's no question that there are still problems, that there are still mistakes. But I mean, even as we talk about, marriage equality being under attack and these different things, I mean, it was, I think, almost just under 100 years ago that a white man and a black woman couldn't get married in Virginia.
Yeah.
So I mean, the Loving case was a precedent cited in the Obergefell case that created or established marriage equality nationwide. So, yeah, when I see court clerks refusing to give out marriage license to gay couples in Alabama, it pisses me off because that's a problem, and it's a problem that needs to be fixed. And not everything, of course, is about marriage, but I do think that that's an interesting milestone. And I do think that even as we see these problems, I'm just not convinced that they're getting worse. Maybe in the last 5 years, they're worse than the previous 5 years. I don't even know that that's true. But when you zoom out far enough and you start looking at 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, I'm just not convinced that the divide between the good states and the bad states, or the blue states and the red states, or the progressive versus the conservative. I'm just not convinced that divide is widening in a meaningful way. Perhaps it is, but I don't know that there is data to really reflect that.
I would say one point of optimism was the very thing that you brought up, which was getting, New York getting rid of the gay panic, trans panic stuff.
Yeah,
that is certainly something that I would say shows a trend in the right direction, even if we are still making horrific mistakes that are affecting people's lives and in some cases resulting in people's death along the way. You could look at the trend and say, hey, the trend is towards better, and then you could look at it at any particular scale and see this going on. And how you choose to look at it is going to determine whether or not you're optimistic. But nobody here is suggesting, oh, yeah, we're done. We're like post-homophobia. We're post-racism.
We wouldn't be here every week. I mean, Dr. Ray wouldn't be writing books and starting foundations. You and I wouldn't be doing shows like this. None of this would exist if these problems weren't still huge, giant problems that demand a response.
But I'm saying that, like, for instance, that law, that protection simply would not be passed in the red state, for instance, like Texas, or those other places, and will not unless, for instance, there is an electoral change, right? Some great electoral shift. And, for people who are there, who are in those states right now, I mean, like, it's more than likely that like such a shift won't even happen in their lifetime.
Oh yeah, and it's one of the reasons why I'm largely opposed to states' rights, and why I'm a big fan of the fact that we are in the United States, and so that if your state is full of bigots who don't want to give people their rights and don't want to pass marriage equality, we have a national level thing that'll supersede it, so that we can basically force bigots to do the right thing. Because there's all kinds of shit that would have never passed in Texas.
Oh yeah, no question.
Right. Yeah. Every time the religious powers are attacked or feel attacked, they become more fundamentalist. That's my thesis anyway. I wrote about that in my book, The God Virus. Every time a religion feels it's under attack, or if it is attacked, there are fundamentalists that come out in defense of that. We saw it in Islam when the Crusades went to the Middle East in the 1100 and 1200s. There was a radical fundamentalism arose out of that. Same things happened after 9/11, or as a part of 9/11. I don't want to get into too many details, but what I want to say is, whenever Islam is being attacked, or wherever Christianity is attacked, or Hinduism is being attacked, we can easily see examples of where it becomes more vociferous. And that's what we're seeing in the South, because the most religious areas are going to increase their religiosity, and they're going to get out, and they're going to vote, and they're going to elect people who will then enact legislation. Saw the same thing after the 1954 desegregation ruling by the Supreme Court. It didn't stop the states from enacting all sorts of new laws that were unconstitutional.
And erecting all of these monuments to Confederate war heroes and all of these things. Yeah, there is that fundamentalism that comes as a response.
The South lost the Civil War.
Yeah,
and for the next 40 or 50 years, they did everything they could to reimpose their rule, the white supremacist rule, over the entire South. I mean, so what we're seeing, I want to just answer directly to Stan. What we're seeing, Stan, in my estimation, is that we're seeing an increase in the fundamentalist response to their perceived attack. And it may be perceived or it may be real. I don't really care at this point in time. we're saying you're wrong and you can't take people's rights away from you. And they're saying, well, we're going to do it anyway. We're going to show you that we can do it anyway. It happens every time you see this kind of cycle. So it's up and down, up and down, up and down. I think what you two are saying is the general trend's still up, but there's some pretty big dips in that up and down.
No, the optimist in me looks at that as like the final death throes of the dragon before it keels over.
Yeah,
so it's going to be most violent right before it is about to succumb to its demise.
Sure. I mean, to steal Dr. Ray's analogy, I think of it as like a fever. You know, I mean, as the virus is starting to take over, or I guess in this instance, the free thought is starting to become more prevalent and the body is reacting.
Right.
And that's, painful. But it isn't necessarily a good sign for the body. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not being overtaken by the virus. A fever is usually a sign of unhealth or unwellness. So.
Right.
Well, to your point, Christy, that reminds me of something President Obama said, saying that, the fever is going to break. Like, we have to break the fever of the Republicans. Like, watching as this presidency went by, Republicans becoming more and more extreme, like, in their views and fighting and fighting against the Democratic Party. And, he made a famous quote saying that, we have to break this fever, right? But it's not. I mean, I think Donald Trump is in reaction saying that it's not. I think there's a trajectory that they're traveling along. I mean, I guess maybe it is also to Dr. Ray's point that they're finding new ways, right? To attack a liberal society, right? Mm-hmm. So before it was easy to attack blacks, right? They were the easy target, right? And then that became unacceptable. So then they moved on to gays, right? And then that became less acceptable. And now they're on to immigrants, which is a perennial, fear for them. Mm-hmm. And trans people, right? Trans people, there's been this huge uptick, right, in talking about them. And so, that's been a really big focus of their oppression, right?
Although,
go ahead.
So we have to stay nonpartisan. So rather than breaking it down along political lines, talking about it with respect to the issue, nothing unites people like convincing them that they have a common enemy. Yeah. And for people who feel like their way of life is fading and the world is going to hell in a handbasket, once you convince them, oh, no, here's our new common enemy. And this time it's the LGBTQ community, or this time it's immigrants, or this time it's, whoever. That's one way to kind of drum up support. The nice thing, and this is me, of course, being optimistic again, I have friends who don't want these bigoted, racist, fascist jackasses to exercise their free speech at all. And I want them personally just comfortable enough so that we can identify who they are. Because otherwise you have a hidden problem. If you make it so that nobody will talk about it, now all of a sudden you still have, for example, racist people on police forces. It's just you don't know how to identify who they are as easily as when they're just happy enough. It's like when there's 1,000 people at a Pride festival and a dozen, swastika-wearing bigots show up. Yeah, okay, it's definitely a bad thing, but now I know who they are. Mm-hmm. And I also know they're massively outnumbered.
Yeah. So I think it has to do with how you zoom, how closely you look at it, because there are problems, and then it does turn into a little bit of perspective. Yeah. How you interpret those problems, and whether you have a sense of hopefulness about your own picture of the future. And I get why it's difficult to feel hopeful sometimes. I think that's very human when you're seeing other human beings having the rights stripped away. I don't know that there's really a way to answer the question, but I hope that we've kind of poked around the edges of it and at least given you some ideas of what we're looking at.
So get out and find a candidate you support and vote. That's the moral of the story. Those people who sat home and didn't vote, we're getting the results of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks so much for taking my call. I really appreciate your time. And this was helpful. Have a great night.
Hey, thank you so much.
Bye.
So yeah, I mean, these are big picture items. I wish that we had a concrete answer. I mean, I wish somebody would call up and say, hey, what's the name of this kink, or something that I could walk away from being like, oh, I know this one. But these are problems without easy solutions.